One of their strategies was to accuse the USSR of imperialism and conflate it with American imperialism. For example, acting like the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which was at the request of a Marxist democratic government, which was being set up there at
This would be like saying the US invasion of South Vietnam wasn't imperialism because the South Vietnamese government technically requested it. Now, the US backed a coup against their leader once he became inconvenient for us, but both before and after the coup, it was absolutely imperialism. The black dots represent places the US bombed. The South Vietnamese government wasn't elected, it didn't have popular support, and it was being propped up by imperial powers. Now let's look at the Soviets in Afghanistan. In 1978, there's a revolution and the communists come to power. Taraki becomes the new leader. He's then taken out in a coup backed by Brezhnev and the Soviets. Hafizullah Amin becomes the leader. Despite the revolution, the communists don't really have popular support, and so Amin requests Soviet troops to help maintain his government. The Soviets do invade. They also take out Amin and install their own leader, and proceed to wage a devastating war that kills over 1 million Afghans. You can literally see the population drop from when the war started. Now, simultaneously, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan waged their own imperialist war, funneling billions in weapons and support to some of the most extremist factions of the Mujahideen fighters. All of that to say, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was of course an act of imperialism. To this day, Afghans are being brutalized by imperialist practices. Sure, the US withdrew troops, but they also froze their central bank's assets along with several other Western nations, and now millions of Afghans are on the brink of starvation. I need to issue a correction to my previous video because I said something that was simply wrong. It was not my claim that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was imperialism. It absolutely was, and we'll get to it in a second. Taraki becomes the new leader. He's then taken out in a coup backed by Brezhnev and the Soviets. What I said there was not true. While the Soviets did have their issues with Taraki, they did prefer him to Amin. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with Wikipedia. The quote I referenced is pretty easy to find. Ironically, I misinterpreted the quote the same way Amin did. He thought the Soviets supported his coup against Taraki. That's why he supported Soviet troops coming in to help sustain his government. But in reality, many of the issues the Soviets had with Taraki were accentuated by Amin. This gets into the ideological split that existed between the Afghanistan Communist Party at the time, with Amin and Taraki representing the Khalq faction on one side and Karmal and Najibullah representing the Parcham faction on the other. Under Taraki's government, and really spearheaded by Amin, there were purges of the Parcham faction. The Soviets did not like this. The purges continued even after Karmal and Taraki met in Moscow, and ultimately when the Soviets invade and depose Amin, they install Karmal as the new leader. He was very pro-Soviet, even floated the idea of making Afghanistan one of their republics. Now there's also this claim floating around there that not only did the Soviets not like that Amin deposed Taraki, but that he was also a CIA asset. Now we do know that both Amin and Taraki were on the KGB payroll at one point, but claims that Amin was CIA are not as well substantiated. What's funny is that this sort of allegation was apparently thrown around a lot at the time, because at one point the former president of Afghanistan, Mohammed Daoud, and Karmal claimed that Taraki was a CIA spy. But the claim that Amin was CIA originally falsely claimed from the KGB because they wanted to discredit him because they didn't like what he was doing. But then after Amin had a few secret meetings with US diplomats, the KGB was like, oh my gosh, was that actually true? But while we still don't entirely know what those meetings were about, we are decades later and we still just don't seem to have the evidence that Amin was actually CIA. But even if the Soviets truly believed that Amin was CIA, it doesn't give them the justification to invade and contribute to a war that killed over 1 million Afghans. The Soviets were clearly treating this as a puppet government. A few years into the invasion, the Soviets didn't like Karmal anymore, and so they removed him and replaced him with Najibullah. The Soviets waged a brutal bombing campaign. Roughly 80% of the buildings in Panjshir were either destroyed or had damage done to them. So many people fled Kandahar that the population fell from 250,000 to 25,000. The Soviets planted millions of explosives across the country, and the people of Afghanistan were still feeling the repercussions of those explosives years after the Soviets had left. And no, this doesn't justify the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan pumping billions in weapons and support to some of the most extremist Mujahideen fighters. I was wrong when I said the Soviets supported Taraki's removal. They did have some really significant critiques of Taraki, but they definitely disliked Amin more. To try and claim that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was not imperialism, in my opinion, is just silly.